Hey y'all, as many of you all know, I love keyboards, and specifically I love 65% keyboards. In fact, most of the boards in my collection are exclusively 65% keyboards or some variant of 65s. For those of you into keyboards, you may have actually heard of Alps key switches. Without getting too far into it, Alps are a long discontinued switch, and most of the boards that contain them are older and they feature form factors that are kind of bulky and not really my style. So at this point, I never really added one to my collection. Well, that all changed when I saw this video by Matt. In the video, he modifies an Apple desktop bus keyboard to be fully functional with Bluetooth. I had never heard of the keyboard before, but it checked so many boxes for me. It had a form factor I liked, incredibly thick PBT keycaps, and it sported an amazing retro font. After seeing the video where he put new life into that retro board, I knew I had to have one of my own. And because Matt did all the work, I figured it wouldn't be that difficult at all. I mean, he reverse engineered the original board, he created a custom PCB and firmware, he designed all the 3D models for the mounts. All I had to do was order the parts and assemble everything, right? Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. I ran into issue after issue. I spent way more money than I thought I would, and ultimately I had to cut a few corners to even keep my sanity in the whole project. All that said, come along with me and watch, and you'll see what it's like to modify a keyboard with limited instructions, little planning, and a whole lot of determination. All right, so I started by picking up a working version of the board from an eBay seller, and that cost me about $213. Yeah, that price is pretty steep, but we are talking about buying an item that was made in the 80s, and for reference, I was made in the 90s. While I was waiting for the board, I also ordered the custom PCBs from JLC for like $57. I ordered the e-ink screen and battery for $28, the microcontrollers for about $36, and the USB connectors for about $11. So once everything came in, I started unboxing the board first, and it was pretty dirty. But it appeared to be in good shape, and I had no way to test it, so I was really just going on the seller's word that it was working like it should. For the PCB, I opted to get most of the components pre-populated to save myself the trouble later, and actually this did cause me a little bit of issue later. The other components, like the screen, battery, microcontrollers, they all arrived and they seemed to be exactly what I needed, so there was no concern there either. Now that everything was in, I decided to start with getting the keyboard cleaned up a bit. I started by removing all the keycaps. With all the keycaps removed, I immediately got to work on scrubbing them to remove all the years of dirt and grime. It's kind of weird, like, this keyboard had a whole life and now it's about to be part of some keyboard nerd's collection. Well, anyway, with the keycaps removed, I could see just how much dirt and dust was hiding under the keys, and my first instinct was really just to scrub away all the debris. But I decided to hold off until I could hit it with some pressurized air outside first to help, not make everything so gross. With that in mind, I set the remaining plastic parts for the keyboard aside, as I planned on cleaning them a bit later, and I planned on using a retrobriting technique to help restore some of the original color of that plastic, but we'll talk more about that later. While I waited for the keycaps to dry, I started assembling the PCB by soldering on the USB-C connector. This was not the smoothest process, and I ended up blocking the camera pretty badly, so I apologize that you all missed most of it, but ultimately it was more frustrating than entertaining. But eventually I did get it seated, and I moved on to soldering the microcontroller and header pins, which went way more smoothly. Now that the PCB was populated enough, I decided I wanted to flash the ZMK firmware. Now this was where the troubles really began. While I had used ZMK before in a previous design, that was way earlier on in ZMK's lifespan, so at this point I was pretty unfamiliar with the process to generate the firmware. Luckily, I was able to download the firmware directly from the GitHub page that Matt made, and I didn't need to set up the build process myself, so that saved a ton of time. And now that I had the firmware, I had to figure out how to flash the controller. After a bit of Googling, I was able to get the controller into DFU mode, flash it, and give it a quick test. Now that I had the firmware flashed and confirmed that the keys on the board actually worked, I needed to remove a few components from the original board to make room for the custom PCB. In this case, this required removing the original microcontroller from the dip socket and desoldering the ADB ports on both sides of the PCB. With all those components gone, I moved on to mounting the custom PCB in the dip socket for the first time, and as you can see, I really had quite the struggle. I did get it seated, but it did not seem to be getting powered at first. After an embarrassing amount of debugging, I reviewed the PCB traces, and I quickly realized that the power delivery could only come from the battery or the controller when the USB-C cable was attached directly to it. You see, I thought the side USB-C connector could supply power directly, but in hindsight, it makes perfect sense to me why it doesn't. But anyway, with that revelation, I desoldered the battery connector, I soldered on the battery leads. And this brings me to that next point. Remember how in the beginning I mentioned the manufacturer's pre-assembly would cause me problems? Well, this is the moment that actually came to fruition. Truthfully, it's really my fault, and because of my mistake, I had to desolder the connector from the board. This was due to two main reasons. First, the connector was the wrong size for the battery I ordered, When I ordered the PCB's original connector listed in the BOM was out of stock. So instead of actually taking the time to find a correct replacement, I quickly picked one from the manufacturer's BOM tool, and it was not what I ended up needing at all. And the second problem was the orientation of the part. It was soldered on in the wrong orientation than what I was expecting. So that wasn't really a big deal considering the battery I ordered accidentally didn't even come with a connector anyway. But I opted to remove the socket just to make it easier for me to solder the leads of the battery directly to the PCB. So coming back from that tangent, I now had the battery fully connected to the PCB and the PCB reseated. I was able to connect my phone and perform the first wireless test of the device. And to my relief, everything worked as I expected. So while I was on cloud 9, I decided this would be a great time to take a break from the electronics of the build and move on to a part I was dreading, the 3D prints. So let me be clear. I do not hate 3D printing, but I do hate dealing with my 3D printer. You see, I have a pretty basic Ender 3, and it causes me nothing but trouble every time I need to use it. It takes forever to get aligned, and I swear that even looking at it causes it to lose alignment. That said, I guess I enjoy the pain to a degree because I've yet to replace it, even though I say I'm going to replace it every time I touch it. Anyway, I decided to print out the models that Matt designed using the same color filament. And on a side note, he was right. The color of the filament does give a similar vibe to that of the keyboard. So if you do this project, I highly recommend that color specifically. Anyway, after having guaranteed alignment issues and many failed or poor prints, I just decided to reach out to a local print shop to have the parts made instead. And while the difference between what I could print and what they were able to is truly night and day. I mean, I know all of this, I know I say this all the time, but this 100% has convinced me that I need to buy a new printer. It would have made everything in this project way easier. With the prints I needed in hand, I shifted gears back to the PCB. What I needed to do now was to get the screen and encoder soldered onto the board. This ended up being probably the most difficult part of the project because at the time I was recording this, Matt had not released the spec on the cables or really any documentation on the project at all. To make things worse, I did not have the connectors for the OLED and the encoder populated on the board because they were out of stock at the time when I ordered them from the manufacturer. So without knowing the specs for the cables, I just decided that I would solder on individual wires to the connector pads and just reverse engineer the traces. Once I discovered the pinout for the screen, I got it all soldered up and it was working. Once I got the screen on, I discovered some of the pins on the dip socket were bent because of my constant removal of the PCB, probably when I was doing a lot of testing. So I decided to go ahead and replace the cheaper dip socket with some Milmac sockets I had from a previous project as they were way more rigid. And if you're going to do this project, I highly recommend swapping out the sockets from the start. It made things so much easier. But anyway, after that little pit stop, I moved on to the encoder. I started by screwing on the 3D printed adapter, but I think the threads on the model did not exactly line up with the encoder that I purchased. So I had this genius idea just to heat the metal part on the encoder with the heat gun and slide on the adapter. This was admittedly kind of dumb, considering I didn't have an extra adapter if this somehow went south, but it actually ended up working pretty well and fit really nicely into the case. So now I had to actually wire up the encoder. And again, because I didn't have the PCB source files, I had to attempt reverse engineering the pin, and it proved really difficult, even more difficult than the screen. So much so that I really had to just actually dig through the firmware files in Matt's repo and figure everything out. And I came up with this. Now this might be kind of hard to understand, but in short, these bottom 3 pins represent the connections to one of the port expanders on the board, A0 through A2. The A pin of the encoder goes to pin A1 on the expander, the encoder's B pin goes to A2 on the expander, and the button switch on the encoder goes to pin A0. So admittedly, it does look like the switch pin on the encoder is always pulled to ground, so I don't think it actually has any function, but I would need to reference the source PCB files to confirm. Now that I had the correct wiring figured out, I resoldered all of the connections, and just like that, the encoder was working. I applied some heat shrink to the connections, and I moved on to assembling the screen into the better quality print. At this point, I went ahead and reattached most of the keycaps so I could test the layout and the fit of the components in the case. Once I was satisfied with the dry fit, I quickly moved on to getting the Retrobrite setup together for the case and the spacebar. So this is where I made another big mistake. I only purchased 1 container of the peroxide for the process, and it actually couldn't fully cover the parts in the original container I planned on using. So I just had to use a smaller, clear container that I had lying around the house. In the smaller container, all the parts still weren't covered, but it was a lot better than the first container. Anyway, I covered the container and I sat everything outside to let the sun do the hard work. I periodically checked on the parts and I flipped them so that way they could get even more bleaching. It was a pretty cloudy day, but the parts still did show some incredible improvement. I mean, the spacebar alone is completely different than how it looked when I first unboxed the board, when it was incredibly yellow. With everything else out of the way, I was finally able to start reassembling everything. Honestly, I really thought I was in the home stretch, but the screen button just did not want to work once everything was put back together. After taking apart most of the board and threatening to undo my questionable soldering work, I was able to figure out what was causing the issue. The wires for the encoder were not long enough, so when they were stretched during the reassembly, they'd fall under the keycap, and that caused the key to not be able to be pressed. So after fighting quite a bit and trying my best not to have to redo any of the work I did, I was able to figure out a way to route the encoder cabling above the screen, and that allowed the button to be used while the encoder was still in position. So this could have been completely avoided if I had used the proper cables that Matt documented, or if I had just used longer custom cables. So I highly recommend you do either one of those if you decide to attempt the build. So here it is, a modern update to a retro board. I think I spent about a full week or so getting everything together, and I know it's far from perfect. In fact, I left out a few components that Matt actually features in his video, but I am really happy with how it all turned out. And I'm estimating that it cost me about $360.82. Now, to tune out the sound of my wallet crying, let's have a quick typing test. Well, there you have it. I see cool projects on YouTube all the time, but this is my first time actually attempting to build something that I saw somebody else build in a YouTube video. So let me know down below if you found it interesting at all, and tell me about other YouTube projects that have inspired you to build something. Maybe I'll do something like this again.